Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Have Shop Shop. This week, we're going to fix this Subaru and find out what that weird noise was. So the last time you saw this Subaru, I showed you a video of it making a really strange noise. We have life. Well, that sounds really bad. So this thing doesn't actually move under its own power, so I'm pretty sure the clutch is knackered or something to do with the gearbox. So seems like a pretty reasonable assumption. So I've spoken to a mate of mine who's actually a Subaru technician, and he said that it's probably the thrust bearing carrier, or the thrust bearing itself has probably exploded and possibly bent the clutch fork, causing all kinds of drama. So let's get stuck into it and see what happens. First step, I'm going to open the bonnet, put it on jack stands, take the front wheels off, and then we'll take the air intake off, and then we'll try and get the tail shaft out, and then the front drive shafts, then the gearbox. Should be good to go. So I'll show you along the way obviously, but that's the rough plan for today. Alright, so we've got it jacked up, got the wheels off, it's on jack stands. I'm going to try and tackle this airbox now. So there's probably a few sensors I'll have to unplug, and a couple of 10 mils I imagine. Let's get that out of the way to see if we can get to the bell housing bolts. Alright, so that comes off pretty easy. Two 10 mil bolts, one here and one up the top there. Two breathers, one on that side, one on this side. Just here, and just there. And then one sensor, and then the hose clamp that holds it to the throttle body. So the reason I'm showing you this in such detail, because I've already found a problem. The slave cylinder is pushing on the clutch fork, and it's obviously on a wonky angle, so that's a bit strange. Maybe the slave is broken, maybe the fork is bent, but either way I've got a new clutch, so we'll take the gearbox out and find out. Alright, so the next step, which sounds a bit ridiculous, is undo the lower ball joint. So it's this 14 mil here. Take that all the way out, and then I put a pry bar in the little slit here, just to open it up a bit more, if anything, and then knock this ball joint out of the bottom of the knuckle. Now apparently you're supposed to do this because when you take the drive shafts off the gearbox, to get them off fully, you need to be able to move the whole knuckle and everything out the way. So if you undo that, then you can move this whole thing with the strut and just move it all out the way. So I should just mention, when you take this bolt out, don't just loosen it, make sure you take it all the way out, otherwise this ball joint will not come out. Alright, so that can be a bit tricky, but as you can see we've got the ball joint out here. So the reason you need to take the bolt out all the way is because this actually slides into this recess on the ball joint, and there's no way you're going to get that out past the bolt. So take this fully out and then pry that apart, give it a couple whacks with a soft blow hammer, or dead blow, whatever it's called, and it should pop out. Alright, so next step, jack up the back of the car because I forgot about the all-wheel drive stuff. Then take off this heat shield, which is just 4 12 mil bolts, goes above the exhaust and below the tail shaft. Alright, so I'm under the car now, and this is the front passenger side drive shaft. So this roll pin looks like it's been hit on the top, and if you spin it around, it doesn't look like this one's been hit on the top. So I'm imagining it needs to go out that way. So if I hit this one, it should start moving and push out. And if it doesn't, then I'll try the other side. And once it starts moving, I'm going to mark the top of the roll pin and the drive shaft so it goes back in the same way. Apparently that's a thing that you can do wrong, is put that pin in backwards or put it in from the wrong side. So I've got a little punch and a hammer. I'm just going to start tapping on that, and hopefully that roll pin will come out. Alright, so I got one of the pins mostly out. I need to grab a pair of pliers and just pull it out the rest of the way. So I went over to the other side and the exhaust is in the way. So I've taken off the rock cover thing, which is 4 bolts and 2 clips. So they're 12 mils, and then 2 clips up in here. So undo those, and then I'm going to take the exhaust off. So all of these and some bolts back there. So next thing to do is undo the O2 sensor. So it comes up from the exhaust. I'm trying to block the light on the floor there. So it comes up from the exhaust, this little plug here, plugs into this plug here. So undo that so that the O2 sensor can go down with the exhaust. Alright, so I got the front part of the exhaust off, so it's 6 14 mils at the front. I used a deep socket. Then the O2 sensor, then there's a 14 mil just here, which is just a holder or a clamp, and then a 12-14 bolt and nut to do the back flange. So undo all that, take him out. And now we should be able to get to that other drive shaft. Alright, so I've got both the drive shafts out, the front ones, and this is the side that the pin came out of, or sorry, went into. So that is the squarer side. I don't know how well you can see this on camera. If you come around here, see how this side's sort of hollowed out a bit? There's a bit of a taper in there. And then this side, it doesn't have a taper. So this is the side you should hit it in from. So line it all up and hit the roll pin in from this side. So it's got the taper, so you can guide it in a bit easier, and then when you get to this end, it doesn't really matter. So if you try and put it in this end, you're going to have to be perfect, and it's going to be really annoying. So marked the good side that you want to hit from with yellow, and then done the same on the drive shafts, and it'll be ready to go back together once I fix this clutch. Alright, so now I've got the drive shafts out. I'm going to drain the oil, so this is the drain plug, and the fuel plug's actually on the other side at the top, and it's actually got a dipstick. Good job, Subaru. Alright, so while I'm waiting for the oil to drain, I'm just taking the two center bearing bolts out, it's two 14 mils, and now I'm going to tackle the tail shaft where it connects to the diff, which is 12 mils, 4 of. So we'll undo those, and then we should be able to get this tail shaft out. Alright, so I got those 4 tail shaft bolts out. I'm going to take these 6 to get this little plate off, and then I should be able to get the tail shaft out. Alright, so tail shaft's out. Now I'm just going to do this shifter, and then I'll be able to do the bell housing bolts and this back cross member and get the gearbox out. Alright, so next I was taking the shifter out, two 12 mils. You probably don't need to do this one, but it gives you a little bit more wiggling room. And then coming up here, this pin here and this thing here are connected. So take the 12 mil off the end of there, there's a small plate, and then work your way off with this. And then up here, there's this bolt. So this guy here and this one, this is hard to show obviously. So these two are like this, and there's a 12 mil bolt the whole way through here where my thumb is, and take that out, push this to the side, and this will just fall down. So the shifter is disconnected from the gearbox completely, which is where my hand is. So now what I need to do is make sure there's no wiring and no speedo cables, then probably do the bell housing bolts, and then do this gearbox cross member here. Alright, so one thing I've just remembered is this is the Subaru that has the high-low, so that extra cable there, you can see, that is for the high-low gear. So the cable goes all the way to the front here, you can see it up the top here, and it goes to this bracket here. So I'll get that from the top, but I need to undo that, and then there's some wiring I need to unplug, which is probably just this one here, which will be like speedo or something like that. Alright, so just looking at the top of the engine here, I am actually sitting on it. So these wires need to get unplugged because they're actually attached to the gearbox. So I'll undo those few. I did unplug that speedo, or whatever it was, but I could probably plug that back in and just disconnect it here. For sake of argument, I'll just do that and ignore it. So I'm going to undo these 3. There's this thing, which obviously is like an extra stabilizer engine mount type deal. So I'll take that off as well. Then we've got the slave, which I pulled the pin out, and this clutch fork does not feel very good at all. So I'll undo the slave so that can stay with the car. Probably undo the starter so that can stay with the car. And then we've got this thing down here, which I'll show you in a minute when I get the wires out of the way. Alright, so we're onto the high-low gear shifter. So there's a little R clip here, I'll take that out. And I think I'm going to try and undo this one, this bolt and that bolt back there. And hopefully that'll get this bracket free. I'm not 100% sure if there's more holding it on, but I'll try and undo this one and that one over there, and this R clip, and hopefully we should be good to go. You could probably undo that big nut there, but then you'll have to readjust everything, and I don't want to do that. Alright, so that works, no worries. That cable is now free. So I need to do the slave still, and then I'm going to try and take this bracket off because it's actually quite big, and it's attached down there with a couple of 12 mils, and I also need to get the starter out still. Alright, so I've got all the stuff undone that I was talking about. This one starter bolt won't come out, so I need to take this bracket off still, which is fine. I've got that bolt there and 2 more bell housing bolts out. I also found a earth here that is attached to the gearbox, and I've got the slave out the way as well. So I need to climb under the car, take this bracket off, undo the other starter bolt, and then the rest of the bell housing bolts, and then we should be good to go. Alright, so I got the bell housing bolts out, and there's 2 nuts as well, which is quite strange. Got them out, and got the starter motor out, so everything's ready to go. I think I just need to do the cross member and pull it out now. Alright, got the jack with the plate that I made for the truck, chuck that under the gearbox and then undo the crossmember bolts and wiggle it out. Alright, so yesterday I ran into a few issues and then I ran out of time. So the gearbox is completely unbolted and I couldn't actually get it off the engine. I did a bunch of homework. So there's a pin that you're supposed to pull out for the clutch fork, and then you can pull the clutch fork out, then the gearbox will come off. So that doesn't apply to this model. I think it might be too old. So the clutch fork stays in and all the bolts are undone, and it was basically just rusted or frozen or seized or whatever you want to call it to the dowel pins. So I managed to get the gearbox a little bit off the engine, just a tiny little bit, and then I added some fire, made it a little bit easier. Got some pry bars in there, just kept hammering stuff, which is definitely what you shouldn't do, but there was no other way of this happening. Jammed a bunch of WD-40 in there last night, and then, anyway, so I've just got the gearbox off, like 3 seconds ago, but before I got to the gearbox, I found these. So they're ball bearings, and they were sitting on top of the steering rack, and between the steering rack and the crossmember. So they're from the thrust bearing, I'm pretty sure. And I've just taken the gearbox it's about 3 inches out, I'll show you. So the gearbox is this far out, so this is the mating surface here. It's just far enough to get the input shaft out. And then coming under the car, this fell out. So I imagine that's the noise we heard. So that is trashed. There was a bearing, you can see that's where the ball bearings used to run. That's not good. And there's also another piece of metal in there that was just floating around. So I'm going to get the rest of this gearbox the rest of the way out, and then we'll see what other carnage we've got. Alright, so I actually haven't looked yet, but you can see it already. That's pressure plate fins is what that is. I haven't looked at the back of the engine either. Let's collect all these parts. Some sort of rubber or plastic. More fins. There's a lot of fins. This might be worse than the truck. Oh wow. Well, there's the noise. This is good. That's a good one. Alright, let's get this gearbox out of the way and I'll have a look at the back of the engine. Alright, here we go. I haven't looked at this either. Oh, wonderful. I'd say that's why I couldn't get any gears. That's a good one. So let's get the pressure plate off, take the clutch plate out, unbolt the flywheel, put that aside to get machined, and then I'll inspect the damage. Alright, so I got all the bits off. Flywheel actually looks pretty good. You can still see the machine marks in it. So although it looks really good, I'm going to get it redone because otherwise I won't have any clutch warranty or anything like that. The thrust bearing and carrier doesn't look great. I think maybe if I put it back together, a bit of weld, it might come good. I've never seen one like this before. Like that's a lot of carnage. The clutch fork looks pretty good. I think it's still straight. I'll have to check with a mate of mine who's the Subaru tech, see if he reckons that's all good. And then the clutch itself, honestly not horrible. Like it could be better obviously, but it's not bad at all. So someone's been riding the clutch, I would imagine. There's just chunks of stuff everywhere. All the ends of the fingers are all bent over as well. So I'd say someone just left their foot on the clutch all the time. Just rested their foot and heated all of this up. I've never seen these fins break off either, and there's like a whole bunch of carnage around here as well. Pretty crazy. So I'm going to clean up, and it's currently Sunday, and it's public holiday tomorrow. So I'll drop that off when I can. I'll clean up everything else, and then we'll get back to this video when I have a flywheel that's nicely machined. Alright, so I've had the flywheel back. Dropped it off this morning, went to work, picked it up after work. So they did say they could have it back in an hour, but I had to go to work anyway, so I told them not to worry about that. Shout out to Harman Engines again. Thank you very much. So make sure you clean this stuff with brake cleaner. Comes with a bit of oil on it so it doesn't rust. So clean this thoroughly and then clean the bell housing thoroughly. And there's a few other things I need to do before I put this on, but I'll clean this and jump under the car. Alright, so I've just jumped on the back of the Subaru here. The things I needed to do was clean this out because there was a whole bunch of metal and clutch filings and all that sort of stuff, heaps of grime. So what I did is just brake cleaned it all, gave it a quick wipe down, everything looks all good. I got told to check that this wasn't leaking, but it all feels really good. There's no like grime build up underneath it or anything like that, so it's all fine. So I can put the flywheel back on now, but I'll show you what I did in the gearbox first. Alright, so moving over to the gearbox, this is the bell housing obviously. Brake cleaned all of this again, cleaned everything out, got all the chunks out, got all of the ball bearings out, there was a couple more floating around in there, got all those out. Gave this snout a good clean and gave it a quick rub over with 400 grit sandpaper, and same with the input shaft tip. So the other thing I checked while I was in here was the pivot ball bearing, which you'll see is missing because it was actually finger tight and would have eventually wiggled its way out. So I'm glad I checked that, and I also cleaned it thoroughly to make sure that it was all good in the future. So I just need to put that back in and then I can start putting the gearbox back together. However, I am missing a small part which I have to go get tomorrow morning, and I'll explain that tomorrow. Okay, so the next bit I need to do is clean the clutch fork, which is under here, and make sure this fits on there nicely. The part I'm missing, which I have to go get tomorrow morning, is the small little clip that goes from this thrust bearing carrier to the clutch fork. So there's two little like C-clips, which I'm missing because obviously the old thrust bearing doesn't look so great and all the bits went everywhere. So clean up the pressure plate face as well, which I haven't done. You can see the sticker still. So clean all that off with brake clean. Don't use degreaser, use brake clean. And then I'm going to chuck this back in, the pivot ball. Put that back in, put the flywheel on, torque that to 75 Newton meters, and then I can put the clutch together, bolt all that together. Then clean the clutch fork up. And then tomorrow morning I'll get those bits. I'll put the clutch fork back in the gearbox, put the gearbox in, and start putting the car back together. Alright, the hour-and-a-half round trip is complete. I have the little clips, so this is what I was missing, these little clips here. Obviously when the old thrust bearing exploded, they went with it. So I had to drive across town to get those. Done now, it's 10 o'clock, so I need to grease all this up, put it on the gearbox, and put the gearbox in. Alright, so the job of these clips is just to hold the thrust bearing from falling off the end. They are a bit loose, so I'm going to give them a bit of a squeeze. So I'll just take them off, give the clip a bit of a squeeze to make them a bit tighter, put it all back together, and I also want to put grease everywhere. So I want to put it underneath the thrust bearing on this face here, put it in there, all over the clip. I want to put it inside the ball where the pivot is, and also into where the slave pushes. So I just want to grease everything so that this doesn't have metal on metal rubbing, because it gets a bit notchy and apparently can fail like the old one. So I'll do that now and then put it onto the snout and the pivot ball, which I want to also grease both of those, and put it all back together, and then put the rubber boot back in. So my mate that's the Subaru tech just said to use high temp wheel bearing grease. He said that'll be good for what I want to do. So there we go. So there we are, there's grease in everywhere. So I'm just going to do the back of this as well, and then put it all back together into the bell housing. So what you want to do now is once you've clicked that in, make sure that the pivot ball is actually clicked in nicely, and also make sure that this thrust bearing moves nice and smoothly on the snout. It won't be moving that much once it's in the car, but you don't want it to be notchy. Alright, so I got that all assembled. Now I need to get this gearbox into the back of the clutch and onto the back of the engine. So this bit's always tricky. I'll put you on time lapse and we'll see how long it takes. Alright, so the gearbox is back in. It wasn't completely miserable. It kind of sucked a little bit, but the Subarus have a pin, like a stud, and then a nut on the end of it, so you can actually get the gearbox lined up onto those studs and then just push it. So it's like super easy compared to most gearboxes. So I've got 2 more bolts to put in. I've got them in my hand, and then I need to start connecting everything else back together. Alright, so I've just finished doing the shifter. Now I've slipped the drive shafts on and lined up all those paint marks. Also connected the wiring up here. There's a few more that need to go back up the top, but I'm just slowly ticking off the stuff underneath. The gearbox is bolted in fully, the cross member's on. So I'm just going to try and put these pins in and should be able to go up the top. Spinning around, I still have to do the drive shaft and the exhaust and stuff, but that can wait a little bit. That was super easy. Why doesn't everyone do this? Alright, so I got a bit carried away. The under tray's back on, the exhaust is back on, the tail shaft's back on, the heat shield at the back is back on, exhaust is all bolted together, O2 sensor wiring is poked back up the top, I haven't put it back in yet, and everything else is pretty much buttoned up, shifter's done and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to put the ball joints in now, put the wheels back on, put the car on the ground, and then I can reach the top a bit easier and make my life a bit easier. So ball joints, wheels on the ground. Alright, we're back on the ground. Got these two bolts for the airbox, and I've got these few bolts here, one there and one up there. So I'm just going to do this top gearboxy section. So I'll climb on the engine again, put all this stuff back together, plug all those wires back in, make sure they're all out the way of the drive shafts, and then we're pretty much good to go. Alright, on top of the engine again, got the back stabilizer thing bolted in, got the bracket bolted on, got the wiring clip back on, make sure you do that. Got the slave back on with the pin back in, and make sure that that is greased to the clutch fork. So I've just got to do the wiring and that cable down the bottom. So I'll do that cable at the bottom first and then the wiring. And also this earth, don't forget to earth the gearbox. And then before I put the airbox back on, I'm going to have to do the gearbox fluid because it's right here. So I don't want to forget that. Alright, everything's back together. Just going to do the oil and the air filter, and then I'm going to track down a battery. So the oil is right down in there. Hopefully I've got a funnel or something that makes that reasonably easily. Alright, I've got a pretty long, thin funnel there. I know it takes about 3 litres, 3.5 litres, so I've got 2.5 there draining in. So while it's doing that, I'll take the back off of the jack stands and try and get a battery out of that forklift, and hopefully that one fits enough to at least move the Subaru out of the way. Battery's on charge. I think this one came out of one of the VEs. Let's check on this oil, make sure this is all good to go. I'll get this all buttoned up and then we can slap that battery in and hopefully drive it out of the shed. Alright, so putting the air filter back on, just realised that I didn't tell you about this PVC pipe here, or PCV or whatever it is. So just remember that one as well. Then there's one on either side, and then this main one, and the sensor and the throttle body. And then the two 10mm on the top, and then put the battery in and hopefully it'll move. Alright, so she's all back together. This battery is way too wide. It's the right height and the right terminal orientation and probably the right width, but it's about 2 or 3 inches too long. It should be about this big. So I have to go buy a new battery. I also have to go and get plates for this thing, but let's see if it starts and if I can get it onto the concrete over there. We have an illuminated key, that's a good start. We have fuel pump, the window goes down. We're in neutral. It runs. Let's see if clutch feels normal, that's good. It goes into gear and we're moving. Wonderful. Have I got brakes? I do have brakes. Alright, let's move this thing over there. Down the cliff that is my entrance to the shed. Clutch is super smooth. Wonderful. Alright, let's see if we can get reverse for good measure. Doesn't really like reverse. I also have an engine light, so that's good. But it moves. Alright, so that's it for this episode. The Subaru is super low on fuel and it needs a wash. But other than that, I think it's ready to go. I'm going to order some exhaust gaskets as well because it's got a pretty bad exhaust leak. I forgot to do that before, but it's a pretty easy job to do after the fact. And I might get my mate to look at the engine light. But other than that, that's it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.